A desperate king crept through the darkness to break his own law. He was seeking a forbidden audience with the dead, and only one person could provide it, the mysterious woman history calls the Witch of Endor. Her story is one of the most haunting and debated episodes in the entire Bible, a single night that sealed a kingdom's fate. By the end of this exploration, you will understand the true nature of her ancient sorcery, separating centuries of myth from the startling details of Scripture. We will uncover what really happened in that shadowy room, and why a single prophecy spoken from beyond the grave still echoes today. Was she a sinister conjurer of demons, a reluctant medium showing unexpected kindness, or a keeper of older, forgotten truths? What do you believe drives someone to seek answers in the world of the dead? To understand that desperate journey, you must first understand the man making it. King Saul was a towering figure, chosen by God himself to lead Israel. Yet his reign became a slow unraveling of faith and command. He started with such promise, a humble farmer transformed into a warrior king, but a pattern of disobedience began to take root. He grew impatient and offered sacrifices meant only for priests. He defied a direct command to destroy an enemy king and his livestock, keeping the spoils instead. Each act was a crack in his divine mandate, and the response from the prophet Samuel was always the same, a stern and irrevocable rebuke. The bond between king and creator was fraying, thread by thread. Then the silence fell. It was a profound, terrifying silence. For Saul, divine guidance had once flowed through clear channels, the dreams of a king, the sacred lots known as the Urim and Thummim consulted by the high priest, and the direct words of prophets like Samuel. Now those channels went dead. He prayed, but heaven seemed like a vault of brass. He sought visions in dreams, but found only restless, empty sleep. The priestly oracles gave no answer. It was as if the universe itself had turned its back on him. This divine silence is the key to his desperation, a spiritual abandonment that left him utterly alone. And into that vacuum of guidance rushed a very tangible, earthly fear. The massive Philistine army had gathered at Shunem, their chariots and warriors a dark stain upon the land. Saul's own forces trembled at the sight, their hearts melting like water. Here was the king, paralyzed. He could not devise a strategy, could not rally his men, because he had no idea what to do. The man who once led with confidence was now besieged from within by paranoia, and from without by an unbeatable foe. His court was a place of whispers and suspicion, his leadership hollowed out by the absence of any higher purpose. He was a king adrift, staring into the abyss of his own destruction. This is the perfect storm that brewed in Saul's soul, a cyclone of past failure, present silence, and future terror. His own law, a righteous decree banning all mediums and spiritists from the land, now stood as a monumental irony. He had outlawed the very practice he now saw as his only remaining option. When every approved door is locked, the forbidden one begins to glow with a terrible allure. So he gave the order to his servants, "Find me a woman who is a medium, someone who can call up the dead." He was not seeking power now. He was seeking a single answer, any answer, to break the unbearable quiet. He was ready to trade his kingdom's law for a ghost's counsel, setting the stage for history's most fateful seance. And so the king became a fugitive from his own throne. Shedding his royal robes, Saul wrapped himself in the plain, coarse garments of a common traveler. A desperate disguise meant to hide the most recognizable face in the kingdom. With only 2 trusted servants, he slipped out under the cover of night, leaving behind his army and his crown. Their destination was the small village of Endor. a journey of several miles through treacherous, shadowed hills that sat perilously close to the encamped Philistine forces. Every rustle in the dark could be an enemy scout. Every distant fire might mark a hostile patrol. This was not a stately procession. It was a covert dash through the valley of the shadow of death. Endor, the name itself holds a clue, meaning fountain of generation or habitation, a place of deep, enduring springs. In the ancient world, such places were often seen as thin places, locations where the veil between worlds was naturally porous. It is likely Endor had a reputation, a whispered knowledge that someone there still practiced the old, forbidden ways, the kind of folk magic that official religion had tried to stamp out. For Saul, finding this woman was a monstrous gamble. He was the king who had purged the land of necromancers and spiritists, commanding that such practitioners be put to death. Now he was actively seeking one out. The irony was lethal. If he were recognized by his own people, he would be exposed as a hypocrite and a criminal under his own decree, forced to condemn himself. The political and spiritual risk was absolute. He was betting his entire remaining authority on a single conversation with the dead, a conversation he had made illegal. Think of the chilling solitude of that walk, the weight of each silent step. The man who once led thousands now crept like a thief toward the one light he believed could pierce his darkness, a light he himself had sworn to extinguish. The door to her home opened not to a cackling sorceress, but to a frightened woman. This is our first crucial correction, for the Hebrew word used for her is not witch, but ob, pronounced ov. It means a necromancer, a pit, or one who possesses a familiar spirit, a medium who acts as a conduit for the dead. She was likely an elderly figure, a keeper of traditions that predated Israel's kings, practicing the lingering folk rites of the Canaanite world from the shadows. Her power was not in casting spells, but in bridging a gap, a human pit through which voices from the other side might whisper. When she heard the knock in the dead of night and saw the shapes of three men, her reaction was not mystical. It was visceral, human terror. "You are trying to entrap me and get me killed," she said immediately. Her first thought was of Saul's decree, the law that demanded her death. This tells us everything. She was not a powerful figure flaunting her craft. She was a marginalized one, surviving on the fringes, aware that her very existence was a capital crime. Her fear makes her instantly real, a person before she is a medium. To calm her, Saul swore a solemn oath by the Lord himself, a staggering act of hypocrisy. "As long as the Lord lives," he vowed, "no punishment shall come upon you for this thing." The king who outlawed her practice now invoked his God to guarantee her safety. Just so she would break his own law for him. It was a desperate, circular bargain that exposed the complete collapse of his moral authority. Only then, with this royal promise shielding her, did she ask the fateful question, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" And Saul's answer was simple, direct, and loaded with a lifetime of regret. "Bring up Samuel for me." He did not want to speak to just any spirit. He wanted the prophet who had anointed him, who had rebuked him, who represented the last clear connection to divine guidance he had ever known. In seeking Samuel, Saul was not looking for a military strategy. He was seeking absolution, a final verdict from the one man whose judgment he could never escape. The stage was set, not for a demonic spectacle, but for a profoundly unsettling encounter that would blur every line between the living and the dead. Her survival now hinged on a king's word, a word she had every reason to distrust. Yet Saul's oath was not casual. It was the most solemn vow a man of Israel could make. By swearing by Yahweh, the very God whose laws condemned her practice, Saul was placing his own soul in jeopardy if he broke his promise. This was not a political guarantee. It was a spiritual contract. He was essentially saying, "May my God destroy me if I betray you." For the woman, this transformed the situation. The king's terrifying decree was now being suspended by the king's own sacred vow. His desperation had created a paradoxical safe space, a temporary bubble where the forbidden could occur. It was this ultimate pledge that finally overcame her resistance. With that protection in place, she moved to the heart of the matter. Her question was practical and precise. "Whom shall I bring up for you?" This single line shatters the image of a generic, smoky seance. She was not offering a parade of random spirits or a carnival of the dead. This was a targeted retrieval, a specific summons. It implies a technique, a ritual focus, an ability to call a particular soul from the vast unknown. Think of it not as casting a wide net, but as dialing a direct, otherworldly number. Saul's answer confirmed the deeply personal nature of this crisis. "Bring up Samuel for me." He did not ask for a famed warrior to devise a battle plan. He did not seek a wise ancestor for general advice. He named the one person who represented the crushing weight of his own failures, the prophet who had anointed him and then utterly rejected him. In seeking Samuel, Saul was confessing a profound truth. He did not want just any answer. He wanted the answer from the only authority he still recognized, even in death. He was returning to the source of his blessing to hear the source of his curse. This was a consultation drenched in personal history, regret, and a terrified need for closure. The stage was no longer a hidden room in Endor. It was the courtroom of Saul's own conscience, and the ghost of Samuel was about to serve as both witness and judge. The room held its breath. What happened next was not a flash of light or a cloud of smoke, but something far more intimate and unsettling. The biblical text is sparse, giving us only a few critical clues. The woman saw Samuel, and she cried out with a loud voice. Her reaction is our first real window into the mechanics of the ritual. She did not calmly announce his arrival, she screamed. This suggests the process was not a staged illusion she controlled, but an encounter that shocked even her, the practitioner. The text says she perceived that it was Samuel. The Hebrew word implies a deep, intuitive recognition, a knowing that bypassed the eyes. This was not a vague shape in the gloom. It was a specific, identifiable presence she immediately knew. So how did she do it? While the Bible does not give us a step-by-step manual, scholars piece together the practice from the word used to describe her, the ob. This term can mean a necromancer, but its root also means a wineskin or a bottle, and by extension, a ritual pit. This is profound. The medium was not just a person. She was seen as a vessel, a hollow container through which the spirit of the dead could briefly flow and speak. Some ancient traditions involved literally digging a pit, a symbolic gateway to the underworld, where offerings were poured and invocations made. The ritual might have involved low, rhythmic chanting specific herbs, burned for their trance-inducing properties, or the repetitive tapping of a drum to alter her own consciousness, to make herself an empty wineskin ready to be filled by another. This stands in stark contrast to the modern image of a Victorian séance with floating tables and mysterious wraps. This was older, darker, and more visceral. It was about creating a human conduit, a temporary rent in the fabric separating the worlds. To understand its power, we look to the world Saul and this woman inhabited. Ancient Mesopotamia feared the Etimu, the restless, hungry spirits of the dead, who could curse the living, if not appeased with food and drink offerings. In Egypt, elaborate rituals and spell books, like the Book of the Dead, were designed to help the deceased navigate the afterlife. and the living sometimes sought their counsel through dream incubation at tombs. The practice at Endor was a surviving fragment of this universal, pre-monotheistic spiritism, a folk memory of how to speak to those who have passed on. It was the old religion lingering in the shadows of the new. In that quiet room, the Witch of Endor was not performing a magic trick. She was tapping into a deep, ancestral river of belief, one that flowed long before kings and prophets, and one whose waters, once stirred, could reveal truths too terrible to bear. Her scream tore through the night, a raw sound of pure, unscripted terror. The woman saw Samuel, and she cried out with a loud voice. That single verb, saw, holds a universe of meaning. In the context of her practice, it almost certainly means she perceived him through her spiritual senses, the inner sight honed by her rituals. Yet the violence of her reaction tells us this perception was not a gentle vision. It was an overwhelming, immediate reality. This was not the hazy impression of a spirit she was guiding into the room. This was the sudden, definitive appearance of the prophet Samuel himself. Her shock is the most critical evidence we have. A charlatan, performing a staged act for a disguised client, would have remained in control, calmly narrating the arrival. A true practitioner, expecting a manageable connection, might have shown concentration or effort. Her loud cry reveals neither, it reveals fright. This event exceeded her experience, breaking the boundaries of whatever normal ritual she performed. It suggests that whatever mechanism she used to open a door, something far more powerful walked through it. So where did Samuel come from? The ancient Hebrew understanding of the afterlife was a place called Sheol, a shadowy, silent realm beneath the earth where all the dead, good and bad, resided in a kind of conscious dormancy. It was not a place of punishment or reward, just existence separated from the light and activity of the living world. The common belief was that the dead in Sheol could be disturbed or summoned, but they were generally weak, whispery echoes of their former selves. Samuel was none of those things. He appeared not as a faint shade, but as an old man wrapped in a robe, a figure of unmistakable identity and authority. His first words are not to Saul, but a direct, irritated challenge to the one who disturbed him. Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? This implies a forceful retrieval, an unwelcome pulling from his rest. The most compelling interpretation is that God himself allowed, or even directed, this specific manifestation. The divine silence Saul had been enduring was now broken in the most terrifying way possible. Not with guidance, but with final judgment delivered by the one prophet Saul could not ignore. The medium's art had provided the occasion, but a higher power seized the moment, turning a forbidden seance into a courtroom from beyond the grave. In that instant, the Witch of Endor was no longer the conductor of the ritual. She was its first and most terrified witness, staring into a reality far deeper than her pits and chants could ever contain. The prophet's words were not a greeting, they were an indictment. Samuel's voice, channeled through that shadowed room, carried the full weight of a divine sentence already passed. Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? Saul answered, describing his utter terror, the silence from God, the looming Philistine army. He begged for guidance, any guidance. What Samuel gave him was not a strategy, but a verdict. He repeated the judgment from years before, a judgment Saul had hoped death might soften. The Lord has turned away from you and become your enemy. The kingdom has been torn from your hand and given to your neighbor, to David. Then the prophet moved from the past to the immediate, horrifying future. Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines. Every word was a nail in a coffin. Saul had sought a way out, a loophole in his fate. Samuel gave him none. This was not a conversation between two men, one living and one dead. This was the completion of a prophecy, a final scroll unsealed and read aloud in the most unexpected of courtrooms. The tone was absolute, forensic, and devoid of any hope. Even in death, Samuel's role as God's messenger was unchanged, his authority undimmed. The chilling irony is almost unbearable. Saul had broken his own law and risked everything to hear from Samuel, believing the prophet might offer some solace, some last-minute reprieve. Instead, Samuel confirmed his worst fears with brutal, time-stamped precision. The man Saul sought for comfort became the instrument of his final condemnation. In seeking to appease the ghost of his past, Saul received only a mirror held up to his inevitable end. He asked for a path forward and was given an expiration date. The silence from God was now over, replaced by a message so clear and so terrible that it left no room for doubt, only dread. The consultation was finished. Saul had his answer. It was the one answer he had been fleeing his entire reign, and now it pursued him into a stranger's home, spoken through the lips of a frightened medium. He had traded his kingdom's law for a ghost's counsel, and the ghost had simply told him the time. The mighty king fell to the earth, his body striking the floor with the full weight of his shattered world. He lay there, stretched out full length, a ruler brought lower than any subject. The prophecy was no longer a distant warning. It was a physical reality pressing him into the dirt. All the strength drained from his limbs, not from battle, but from a terror that hollowed him out. He had eaten nothing all that day and all that night, a fast born not of piety, but of a consuming dread that left no room for hunger. His body was now a mirror of his soul, empty, weak, and utterly broken. This was the human cost of that forbidden consultation. The ghost had not brought a new battle plan. It had simply confirmed the end, and in that confirmation, Saul's final illusion of control evaporated. The truth he had been running from for years finally caught him, in a dim room far from his throne, and it pinned him to the ground. Think of the sheer psychological whiplash. Just hours before, he was the commander of an army, a king making a desperate gamble. Now he was a man so paralyzed by the future that he could not even stand. The prophecy about tomorrow felt less like a prediction and more like a sentence already being carried out in his own flesh. His weakness was total, a collapse of will that rendered the crown on his head meaningless. In that moment, Saul was no longer a king. He was simply a man facing the absolute certainty of his own annihilation. And the floor of a medium's house became the antechamber to his grave. Yet in the midst of this divine judgment, a very human mercy quietly asserted itself. The woman, the medium, looked at the king prostrate on her floor. She had just witnessed a terrifying supernatural event, heard a prophecy of death, and now saw the most powerful man in the land broken before her. Her reaction was not triumph, not fear for her own safety now that her usefulness was over. It was concern. She approached Saul, her voice cutting through his stupor. She said, "Your maidservant has obeyed you. I have taken my life in my hands and have done what you asked of me. Now therefore you also obey your maidservant. Let me set a piece of bread before you, so you may eat and have strength when you go on your way." This plea is astonishing. She first reminds him of the immense risk she took at his command, establishing a debt. Then she gently but firmly reverses their roles. The king who commanded her now needs to obey her for his own good. This is not the language of a subject to a sovereign. It is the language of a caretaker to someone in shock. She saw not a failed king, but a starving, broken man. And then she acted with a generosity that defies her outlaw status. The text says she had a fattened calf in the house, and she hurried to slaughter it. She took flour, kneaded it, and baked unleavened bread. This was no meager snack. A fattened calf was a significant store of wealth, a living savings account for a rural family, typically reserved for a major festival or an honored guest. She sacrificed it without hesitation for a man who, hours before, represented the very power that could have her executed. The unleavened bread, baked quickly without yeast, shows her haste and practical care. She was moving with purpose to revive him. So what motivated this act? Was it mere hospitality, a cultural obligation to feed a guest? That seems too shallow, given the extraordinary circumstances. Was it fear, perhaps a pragmatic worry that if the king died of weakness in her home, his servants or army would surely hold her responsible? There is logic there. But the biblical narrative, by including this tender, detailed scene, seems to point towards something more profound, genuine compassion. She had just been the conduit for a horrifying truth. In the echoing silence after Samuel's voice faded, she was left with the human wreckage of that truth. Her response was to offer the most fundamental comfort: food, warmth, and a moment of respite. This complexity is the key to understanding the true Witch of Endor. She is not a cartoonish villain cackling over a cauldron. She is a multifaceted human being, a practitioner of a forbidden trade who nonetheless operates within a web of human obligation, risk, and empathy. She is a woman who knows the art of summoning the dead, but who also knows the simple, vital art of sustaining the living. In that meal, we see the full, contradictory picture: the outlaw and the nurturer, the fearful medium and the compassionate host, existing in the same person. It forces us to ask, can someone who traffics in the occult also perform an act of pure kindness? The story answers with a quiet, undeniable yes. Saul 8. In the quiet of that outlaw's home, the condemned king broke his fast with the food of his executioner, or perhaps his only friend. The meal she prepared was not a feast, but it was profoundly significant. Unleavened bread, baked in haste without the rising agent of yeast, and the meat of a freshly slaughtered calf. This was not the leisurely meal of a victor, but the urgent sustenance of a man on the run. A last supper shared with his two loyal servants. Think of the scene. The prophecy of death still hung in the air like smoke, yet around a simple table, they found a moment of grim communion. They ate not to celebrate, but to gather strength for the final walk into the prophecy's fulfillment. This meal in Endor echoes other Last Suppers across sacred story. From the Passover meal of the Exodus, eaten in haste before a journey to freedom, to the final shared cup of a different teacher centuries later. In each, food transcends mere nourishment to become a sacrament, a tangible anchor in the face of the unfathomable. For Saul, this bread and meat were a sacrament of a terrible acceptance. By eating, he was not fighting the verdict anymore. He was internalizing it, taking the strength to walk toward the very fate Samuel had decreed. The woman's act of hospitality created a pocket of grace in a house of judgment. Here is the stunning paradox. This moment of human care, of basic kindness, occurred entirely outside the sanctioned religious structures of Israel. The temple priests offered no comfort. The approved oracles gave no answer. The last tender act Saul would ever experience came from a woman whose profession he had outlawed. It forces a difficult, beautiful question. Can grace operate through unexpected channels? Can a moment of pure humanity flicker in a place deemed spiritually unclean by the law? The story answers with a quiet, powerful yes. It suggests that compassion is not the sole property of temples and priests. It can appear in a hidden room, offered by a pair of hands that also know the rituals of the dead. In feeding the broken king, the Witch of Endor performed her final and most human magic. She gave him not a reprieve from his destiny, but the dignity to face it. She offered a space, however brief, where he was not a failed monarch, but simply a guest in need of a meal. And in that act, the narrative complicates itself once more, refusing to let us see her as merely a sorceress or a saint, but forever as both. That quiet meal in Endor was an act of profound rebellion, not just against a king, but against the very bedrock of Israel's identity. To grasp the full weight of her actions and Saul's hypocrisy, we must step back and see the sweeping legal landscape they both violated. The laws against her craft were not a minor footnote, they were central commandments, repeated with stern clarity. The book of Exodus delivers a blunt decree: "You shall not permit a sorceress to live." Leviticus warns the people not to turn to mediums or necromancers. Do not seek them out and be defiled by them. It states plainly that a man or a woman who is a medium shall surely be put to death. They shall be stoned with stones. But the most comprehensive condemnation comes in Deuteronomy, a passage that reads like a spiritual quarantine for the promised land. It commands that when you enter the land, you shall not learn to follow the abominable practices of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who practices divination, or tells fortunes, or interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or a charmer, or a medium, or a necromancer, or one who inquires of the dead. For whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord. The list is exhaustive, covering every form of occult consultation Saul would eventually seek. The punishment for all of it was death. This was the law Saul himself had enforced, the very reason the woman trembled at his knock. But why such absolute, severe prohibition? The reason was not merely about superstition or fear of fraud. It was theological, touching the core of Israel's covenant with God. Yahweh demanded an exclusive relationship. He alone was to be their source of guidance, protection, and revelation. Practices like necromancy, by their very nature, acknowledged and sought power from other spiritual sources, from the realm of the dead, from familiar spirits, from forces outside the divine covenant. Consulting a medium was an act of spiritual adultery, a vote of no confidence in God's ability or willingness to speak. It was seeking a back channel to the supernatural when the front door, prayer and prophecy, seemed locked. It treated the divine as one option among many in a marketplace of spiritual power. And that idea shattered the foundation of monotheism. Every seance, every whispered consultation with the dead, was a crack in the wall separating Israel from the surrounding pagan world. The Witch of Endor, therefore, was not just an eccentric outcast. She was a living symbol of the very practices Israel was commanded to purge from its heart. Her continued existence in the shadows proved the law's imperfect enforcement, a remnant of the old world clinging on. And Saul, by seeking her out, was doing more than breaking a rule. He was enacting the ultimate betrayal of his office, using the king's authority to personally violate the covenant he was sworn to uphold. In that dark room, the lawgiver and the lawbreaker traded places, united in a single forbidden act that revealed how far the kingdom had already fallen. But who was Samuel that his ghost could bring a king to his knees? To understand the power of that apparition, we must know the man in life. Samuel was the last of the great judges and the first of the major prophets, a bridge between eras. His story began with a miraculous birth to a once barren mother, Hannah, who dedicated him to God's service as a child. He grew up in the temple, hearing the voice of the Lord when such divine communication was rare. He became the moral and spiritual compass for a nation in transition, a people who demanded a king like other nations, rejecting the direct rule of God that Samuel represented. It was Samuel who, with a heavy heart, anointed the towering Saul as Israel's first monarch. And it was Samuel who, years later, delivered God's terrible rejection of that same king for his disobedience. Finally, it was Samuel who secretly anointed the young shepherd David as Saul's replacement, setting in motion a rivalry that would define an age. Samuel was not just a prophet, he was the architect of the monarchy, the one man whose authority surpassed the crown itself. His word had made Saul, and his word had unmade him. In life, Samuel was the living conscience of the nation. In death, his voice would carry the same unbearable weight. This brings us to the central, haunting question of the Endor encounter. Who or what did Saul actually speak to that night? The text says the woman saw Samuel, and Saul conversed with him. But for millennia, theologians and scholars have fiercely debated the nature of that presence. There are three primary interpretations, each with profound implications. The first and most straightforward is that it was indeed the disembodied spirit of the prophet Samuel, temporarily summoned from his rest in Sheol. This view takes the biblical narrative at face value. The entity knew intimate details of Saul's past and delivered a precise, accurate prophecy of the future, something a deceptive spirit would be unlikely to do. It behaved with Samuel's recognizable character, righteous indignation and all. If this is true, then the Witch of Endor's ritual, though forbidden, was shockingly effective. It worked. She successfully bridged the gap between the living and the dead, and God allowed it to happen for his own purposes of final judgment. The second interpretation, popular among many early church fathers and later theologians, is that the figure was a demonic impersonation, a daemonian as the ancient Greek translation of the Bible, the Septuagint, suggests. In this view, God would never permit a true prophet to be disturbed by a forbidden occult ritual. Instead, a deceptive familiar spirit associated with the medium took on Samuel's form and voice, using its knowledge of Saul's life and the likely outcome of the battle to deliver a devastating, demoralizing prophecy that sealed Saul's fate. The being's irritable question, "Why have you disturbed me?" could be seen as a clever act, reinforcing the illusion that this was the true Samuel annoyed at being called. This interpretation protects the integrity of the prophet's rest and underscores the danger of the occult, suggesting it opens doors to deceptive and malevolent forces, even when they speak truths that serve a divine end. The third perspective offers a fascinating middle ground. It proposes that the figure was neither Samuel's soul nor a demon, but a prophetic vision or apparition, specifically allowed by God for that moment. Think of it as a divine hologram, a manifestation of God's message wearing Samuel's recognizable form. The medium, through her ritual, created the occasion, but God provided the content directly, bypassing her spiritual machinery entirely. This explains the woman's shock, the figure's accurate prophecy, and the sheer authoritative force of the encounter. It was not a seance succeeding on its own terms, but a sovereign act of God using the context of a seance to deliver a final word to a king who had rejected all other channels. In this reading, the Witch of Endor was a startled stagehand for a drama she did not write. So which is it? The truth is, the text itself does not definitively settle the debate, and that ambiguity is part of its enduring power. Each interpretation reflects a different understanding of God's relationship to the occult, the state of the dead, and the nature of prophecy itself. Was it Samuel, a demon, a God-sent vision? Your answer depends on what you believe about the boundaries between worlds, and whether a forbidden door, once opened, can ever be used for a holy purpose. This paradox cuts to the very heart of divine sovereignty. If God is all-powerful and condemns sorcery, how can a forbidden ritual appear to succeed so spectacularly? The answer lies in a profound distinction between power and permission. Just because God allows something to happen does not mean he endorses the method. Think of it like a judge permitting a liar to take the witness stand. Knowing the liar's testimony will inadvertently reveal the truth that convicts him. The court does not approve of lying, but the judge's overarching authority can use even a corrupt tool to serve a just end. This is the lens through which we must view Endor. The first major interpretation, held by many early church fathers and later reformers, argues that Saul did not speak to Samuel at all, but to a demonic impersonator. In this view, the entity was a daemonian, a familiar spirit associated with a medium, a deceptive intelligence that knew enough of Saul's history and the likely outcome of the coming battle to deliver a crushing, accurate prophecy. Its opening line, "Why have you disturbed me?" was a masterful piece of theater, reinforcing the illusion. This interpretation safeguards a key principle, that the holy prophet Samuel would never be subject to the command of a sorceress. It also presents a terrifying warning. The occult opens doors to malevolent forces that can speak devastating truths to achieve destructive ends. The prophecy came true not because the spirit was Samuel, but because it accurately foresaw the inevitable consequence of Saul's spiritual collapse and military disadvantage. God's permissive will allow the deception as the fitting culmination of Saul's own rebellion. A final, cruel mercy in receiving the answer he sought from the very darkness he had courted. The second interpretation takes the biblical description more literally. It was truly Samuel. But this requires a staggering caveat. It was a unique, one-time divine exception. God, in his sovereignty, temporarily suspended the normal order. He permitted the prophet's spirit to be disturbed and to speak, not because the ritual had power over him, but because God willed it as the definitive medium for his final judgment. The woman's art provided the occasion, the expected channel, but the content was wholly God's. Her shock is the key evidence. The ritual worked far beyond her experience because a higher power hijacked the process. This turns the event from a successful séance into a divine subpoena. Samuel was not summoned by magic. He was sent by God using the context of a séance as his courtroom. The third and perhaps most challenging view suggests that the mechanics of necromancy, while forbidden, were nonetheless real in the ancient world. They tapped into a dark but existent layer of spiritual reality, a corrupted channel for contacting the dead. In this reading, God did not create a new vision or send a demon. He simply used the existing illicit pipeline that Saul and the medium had opened. He allowed the authentic Samuel to respond through it, turning their own forbidden tool against them. This implies a terrifying idea that the occult possesses a genuine, though illegitimate, potency. A power God can redirect, but does not originate. It makes the biblical warnings not just about disobedience, but about dabbling with real and dangerous forces. Each view wrestles with the same core tension: how a holy God interacts with a fallen world's supernatural shadowland. Does he override them with miracles, outwit them with providence, or co-opt them for his sentences? Your answer shapes how you see everything from prayer to prophecy. It asks whether darkness has any power at all, or if it merely exists because the light, for a time, permits it to stand in the witness box. The meal in Endor was a whisper in a world filled with voices from the grave. To truly grasp the weight of Saul's choice and the medium's craft, we must step outside the borders of Israel and listen to the whispers of his neighbors. The practice of consulting the dead was not some strange, isolated superstition. It was a universal thread woven through the fabric of the ancient Near East, a common response to human fear and longing. In Mesopotamia, the world's first great civilization, people lived in constant negotiation with the Etimu. These were the spirits of the dead, believed to be restless, hungry, and potentially dangerous if not properly cared for. Families would pour out libations of water, beer, and honey into pipes leading to tombs, and leave clay bowls of food, literally feeding their ancestors to keep them content and benevolent. The fear was that a neglected Etimu could return as a vengeful ghost, causing illness and misfortune. Consulting them was not just about seeking advice. It was about maintaining a fragile peace with the unseen members of the household. Imagine a world where your deceased grandfather was not a memory, but a present ethereal entity you needed to appease with regular offerings. That was the daily spiritual reality next door. Down the Nile in Egypt, the relationship was even more formal and documented. Egyptians believed the dead, if properly preserved and equipped with spells from the Book of the Dead, retained their consciousness and could influence the world of the living. They practiced something called letters to the dead. These were heartfelt, sometimes desperate pleas written on pottery bowls or linen scrolls, placed in the tomb chapels of the deceased. A widow might write to her late husband, accusing his spirit of causing her illness and begging him to stop. A son might ask his father's ghost to intervene in a bitter inheritance dispute with his brothers. These were not symbolic gestures. They were direct, written communications with a specific soul, expected to act on the family's behalf. The underlying belief was identical to Saul's. The dead possessed knowledge and power unavailable to the living, and they could be petitioned. Closer to home, in the Canaanite culture that surrounded the Israelites, ancestor worship was a cornerstone of domestic religion. The Raphaim, or shades of the dead, were venerated at family shrines. Food and drink offerings were standard, and major decisions, from marriages to property disputes, were believed to benefit from ancestral counsel. This was the spiritual air the early Israelites breathed. When they entered the Promised Land, they were not entering empty territory, but a landscape thick with these practices. The laws we discussed earlier, the stark commands to have no medium or necromancer among you, were not banning an imaginary threat. They were drawing a bright, uncompromising line against the universal culture of their neighbors. Israel's identity was built on a radical alternative. Guidance would come not from the whispering dead below, but from the living God above, speaking through prophets, priests, and sacred lot. This is the crucial context that transforms the Witch of Endor from a bizarre biblical outlier into a profoundly symbolic figure. She was not a unique monster. She was a relic, a living remnant of the old, universal way that Israel's covenant was designed to replace. Her very existence in the hills near the Philistine camp shows how tenaciously these folk traditions persisted, surviving in the margins despite royal decrees. When Saul went to her, he was not just breaking a law, he was culturally regressing. He was rejecting the prophetic revelation that was Israel's distinctive gift and reverting to the ancestral spiritualism of the surrounding nations. In his moment of crisis, he chose the crowded, familiar marketplace of the dead over the solitary, demanding voice of God. Her small house in Endor was therefore a tiny outpost of the ancient world, a place where the old gods and the old ways still held a thread of power. And into that outpost walked a king, surrendering his nation's unique destiny for a moment of clarity from the very shadows he was meant to dispel. The bread from Endor was still heavy in his stomach when the sun rose over Gilboa. The next day had come, and with it, the precise and terrible fulfillment of every word spoken in that shadowed room. The Philistine forces advanced, a tide of iron and resolve against the demoralized Israelites. King Saul stood on the mountain slopes, but the man who led was already broken, his spirit shattered by a prophecy he now had to live through. The battle was less a clash of armies and more an execution of divine sentence. Israel's lines crumbled. The soldiers, sensing their leader's despair, fell by the thousands, their retreat turning into a bloody rout across the rocky terrain. And then the specific blows began to land, just as foretold. Saul's sons were cut down beside him. The crown prince, Jonathan, beloved friend of David and a hero in his own right, fell. His brothers Abinadab and Malchishua fell with him. The future of Saul's royal house was erased in a single afternoon, the dynasty extinguished on the very day it was promised. Saul himself, wounded by Philistine archers, faced the final corner of his fate. He knew capture was imminent, and for a defeated king in the ancient world, that meant torture, humiliation, and a grotesque death at the hands of his enemies. In that moment, he chose the only control he had left. He ordered his armor-bearer to run him through, but the young man, terrified, refused. So Saul took his own sword, placed its hilt against the ground, and fell upon it. The king died by his own hand, on the very mountain where his hope had died the night before. The cause and effect is so stark, it feels like a mechanism clicking shut. Samuel's prophecy was not a vague warning. It was a detailed script, and Saul, his sons, and his army became its unwilling actors. The séance at Endor was not an interesting sidebar to this history. It was the pivotal hinge upon which the entire tragedy swung. And seeking to avoid his destiny, Saul ran directly into its arms. The ghost's counsel did not change the future. It merely forced him to stare at it. And in that paralyzing knowledge, he guaranteed its arrival. The silence of God was finally broken, not with a saving word, but with the sound of a sword hitting the ground and a kingdom falling with its king. The door closed behind Saul, leaving the woman alone with the echoes of prophecy. The Bible's narrative moves on, following the fallen king to Mount Gilboa, and never looking back. Her story, as recorded, ends in that quiet room. So what became of the Witch of Endor after history's spotlight swung away? We are left with only the heavy silence of an unwritten future. And within that silence, a handful of compelling possibilities. The first and most hopeful is that Saul's oath held. He swore by the Lord that no punishment would come upon her. And though he was a broken man marching to his death, he was still the king. His two servants were witnesses to that sacred vow. In the chaotic aftermath of the battle, with the Philistines victorious and Israel in mourning, it is plausible her case was simply forgotten. The new regime under David had far greater concerns than prosecuting an obscure medium in a remote village. She may have lived out her days in Endor, the terrifying secret of that night, buried with the house of Saul. Her survival a small monument to a king's last kept promise. Another, darker possibility is that she fled. She had just witnessed the crown prince of Israel receive his death sentence from a ghost. She knew the location of the king's clandestine treason against his own law. Once Saul and his servants were gone, she had no guarantee of their silence or their survival. Prudence would dictate disappearing before any authority, Israelite or Philistine, could come asking questions. She might have gathered what she could and melted into the hinterlands, becoming a refugee of her own knowledge, her craft perhaps resurfacing in another village under another name. Then there is the realm of legend. In the vast oral traditions that always swirl around biblical events, some later Jewish folklore suggested she was the mother of Abner, Saul's military commander, or even that she was the wife of a man named Dog, tying her into other complex webs of betrayal. These are not historical claims, but they show how the human imagination strives to fill voids. She became a narrative puzzle piece that storytellers tried to fit elsewhere. This profound silence about her fate is not an accident of history. It is a testament. She represents the countless marginalized voices, the shadow dwellers, whose lives intersect power only in fleeting, terrifying moments. They are defined entirely by that single encounter, then vanish from the official record. We know her only as the medium, the witch, the woman of Endor. We do not know her name, her age, her family, her thoughts when she slaughtered the calf, or her fears in the days that followed. She is a silhouette against the flame of a larger story. This is the fate of so many who operated in the occult margins, the cunning folk, the village healers, the keepers of old ways. They appear in the chronicles only when they startle the powerful, and then they are swallowed again by the quiet. Her legacy, therefore, is dual. She is a specific character in a divine drama, and she is also an eternal symbol of all those whose histories are written not in ink, but in whispers, whose full humanity remains just beyond our grasp, lost in the unrecorded dark. Her silhouette, cast by that single night, grew longer with each passing century. The nuanced, fearful woman of the Bible could not be contained by the page. She escaped into the fertile ground of Western imagination, where artists, writers, and composers recast her in their own image. In the fevered minds of medieval demonologists, she was no longer a reluctant medium, but a willing accomplice of Satan. They saw the spirit she summoned not as Samuel, but as a demon in prophetic disguise, and thus she became a textbook example of witchcraft's terrible power. Her story was cited in grim manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, used to justify the very persecutions that would later burn across Europe. She was transformed from a specific person into a principle of evil, a warning against any commerce with the unseen. This demonic interpretation provided the dark pigments for her next incarnation on canvas. In the Baroque era, painters like the Italian master Salvatore Rosa seized her dramatic potential. His famous painting, The Witch of Endor, is a masterpiece of theatrical horror. It shows Saul cowering in a cavernous, ruined space, while the witch, a wild-eyed, ragged figure, gestures frantically over a flaming brazier. Samuel's ghost, a grim, shrouded apparition, rises ominously through the smoke. Every detail is designed to evoke terror and the macabre, emphasizing the illicit, Gothic spectacle of the event. Rosa's witch is an active, powerful sorceress, a far cry from the hesitant woman who feared for her life. This visual portrayal cemented her popular image for generations, defining how people would picture that scene in their minds. The great poets soon gave her a voice, or at least, a legendary status. John Milton, in his epic Paradise Lost, places her in the grand procession of pagan idols and false spirits that corrupt mankind. He mentions that demon as the grisly prophet appeared to the king of Israel, linking her directly to the fallen angels and the great deception of humanity. Here, she is not even a person, but a symbol of the false oracles that stand in opposition to divine truth, a single note in Satan's symphony of lies. Then came the music. George Friedrich Handel, in his majestic oratorio Saul, dedicates an entire scene to Endor. The music he writes for the witch is not a gentle aria, but a scene of chilling, supernatural atmosphere. The orchestra creates a world of shuddering strings and eerie winds, a soundscape of dread. Her recitatives are urgent, fearful, yet commanding. When the spirit of Samuel sings, the bass voice is deep, grave, and unforgiving, a sonic manifestation of divine judgment. Handel's genius was to take the biblical text and amplify its emotional core. But in doing so, he too leaned into the darkness, making the encounter feel like a descent into hell itself. Across these artistic reinterpretations, a pattern emerges. The complexity is sanded away. Her compassion, her practical care, her very human fear are largely forgotten. What remains and is amplified is the moment of supernatural terror. She becomes the archetypal witch, a stock character of horror and forbidden magic. This cultural legacy is a powerful reminder of how stories evolve. The woman of Endor was claimed by theology, dramatized by art, and mythologized by poetry, each layer adding more shadow until the original, complicated figure was almost completely obscured. We are left to wonder, did these artists capture her essential truth? Or did they create a new truth altogether? One that says more about our own fears of the unknown than it does about the woman who once lived in the hills near the Philistine camp. Yet beyond the brushstrokes of artists and the verses of poets lies another layer of interpretation, one that finds not horror but hidden wisdom in the woman of Endor. Within esoteric and Gnostic traditions, her story is read not as a warning against sin, but as a revelation of a deeper, more complex spiritual reality. Gnostics, those seekers of secret knowledge or gnosis, often viewed the Orthodox God of the Old Testament not as the ultimate divine source, but as a lesser, flawed creator god, a demiurge who trapped the divine spark within the material world. From this radical perspective, the Witch of Endor becomes a revolutionary figure. She is a keeper of forbidden gnosis, a conduit to truths that the established religious power, represented by Saul and his laws, sought to suppress. Her ability to contact Samuel is seen not as trafficking with demons, but as accessing a purer spiritual plane outside the control of the jealous demiurge. In this reading, her act is one of sacred rebellion, providing access to a higher wisdom that the official channels had deliberately blocked. She becomes a symbol of the individual's right to seek direct spiritual experience, even if it means breaking the rules of a corrupt or incomplete system. This idea resonates powerfully in modern occultism, where she is sometimes revered as a matron saint of necromancy and psychic mediumship. Practitioners who work with the dead or explore the shadowy realms of the subconscious see in her a patron and a prototype. They honor her not for the fear she inspired, but for her skill, her bravery in performing an illegal act under immense pressure, and her unexpected compassion. She represents the practical knowledge of how to navigate the threshold between worlds, a technical mastery of the spiritual arts that orthodoxy condemned but could not erase. In psychological terms, esoteric thinkers reframe her craft. The underworld of the dead becomes the personal subconscious, the vast inner landscape of repressed memories, instincts, and hidden truths. Samuel's ghost is not an external spirit, but the archetype of the inner critic, the voice of conscience or fate that we often bury. The witch's ritual, then, is a metaphor for the courageous act of shadow work, of descending into our own depths to confront the uncomfortable prophecies we have been avoiding. Her service was to facilitate that confrontation, however painful the result. By this light, her act was indeed a sacred service. She provided the space, the technique, and the unconditional presence for a soul to meet its destiny head-on. She did not judge Saul. She simply made the meeting possible, and then offered bread. This reclamation transforms her from a villain into a guide, a necessary if unsettling figure on the path to self-knowledge. It asks us a profound question. Can a person be both an outlaw to one system and a holy servant of a deeper truth? The esoteric answer is a resonant yes, suggesting that sometimes the most important wisdom is found not in the bright light of the temple, but in the honest shadows of a hidden room, where a frightened woman helps a broken king hear the one thing he most needed to know. That hidden room in Endor feels a world away from the softly lit parlors of the Victorian era. Yet the same fundamental yearning echoes across the centuries. The rise of modern spiritualism in the 1800s presents a startling contrast to the witch's solitary, high-stakes ritual. Where she operated in fear and secrecy, the spiritualist movement was a public, even fashionable, phenomenon. Seances became social events, with participants gathering around a table in a dim room, holding hands and waiting for raps, table tilts, or the voice of a medium in trance to deliver messages from the other side. The tools changed from ritual pits and chants to Ouija boards, automatic writing, and spirit trumpets. But the goal was remarkably similar: to prove survival after death and to receive communication from departed loved ones. The crucial difference, however, lies in the message itself. For Saul, the message was a curse, a definitive judgment that confirmed his isolation and doom. For the Victorian seeker, the message was almost universally one of comfort, assurance that a lost child or spouse was happy and present in a Summerland of peace. The ancient practice existed within a framework of covenant and cosmic law, where contacting the dead was a spiritual transgression with potentially dire consequences. The modern iteration often framed itself within a philosophy of progressive science and benevolent religion, a harmless exploration of natural laws we simply did not yet understand. This shift from taboo to therapy is one of the most profound divides between Endor and today. Another key distinction is the specificity of the summoning. The Witch of Endor was asked for one person, Samuel, and her craft, however it worked, seemed geared toward that targeted retrieval. Modern mediumship, whether in a Victorian circle or a contemporary psychic reading, often involves a more general channeling. The medium enters an altered state, opens themselves to the spirit world, and relays messages from whichever souls step forward, often those most eager to connect with the living participants in the room. It is less a precise summoning and more a broadcast received, focused on personal validation and emotional closure rather than obtaining strategic or prophetic information for matters of state. So has the core human desire changed. At its heart, no, not really. The raw human need to believe that death is not an absolute end, to feel that a connection with someone cherished persists beyond the grave, remains a powerful, almost universal driver. We see it in the ancient Egyptian letters to the dead, in Saul's desperate midnight journey, in the crowded Victorian parlors, and in the quiet hope of someone booking a reading with a medium today. The technology of belief evolves, the cultural packaging transforms, but the essential longing endures to bridge that terrifying, silent gap. Yet the story of Endor injects a sobering note into this continuum of hope. It suggests that not all channels are equal, and not all messages from beyond are benign. It complicates the modern narrative of pure comfort by presenting a scenario where the bridge to the dead became a conduit for unbearable truth and fatal despair. It asks us whether our desire for connection might sometimes lead us to seek answers in places that cannot offer the solace we crave. Or worse, that might offer a clarity we are not prepared to bear. In the end, the woman of Endor and the modern medium both stand at the same mysterious threshold, interpreters of static from the other side. One worked in the shadow of divine law, the other in the light of personal healing. But both answer in their own ways the oldest and most haunting of human questions. What whispers on the other side of silence? And are we brave enough to listen? Perhaps the most unsettling interpretation requires no spirits at all. Strip away the supernatural, and you are left with a king at the absolute limit of human endurance. He had not eaten for a full day and night, a state of severe fasting that alone can induce dizziness, confusion, and altered perception. He was paralyzed by the terror of an unbeatable army. He was drowning in the guilt of his own failures, with the ghost of Samuel as the relentless voice of his conscience. This is the recipe for a profound psychological crisis, a perfect storm where the mind can no longer distinguish internal torment from external reality. What if the seance at Endor was not a summoning, but a manifestation? What if Samuel's ghost was not an apparition from Sheol, but a hallucination projected from the darkest depths of Saul's own psyche? From this modern lens, the entire event transforms into a powerful psychodrama, a play staged by a broken mind. The Witch of Endor in this reading becomes not a medium for the dead, but a therapist of the subconscious. Her ritual, with its rhythmic chants, its focused darkness, its atmosphere of expectation, provided the perfect stage. It was a controlled environment where Saul's internal demons were invited to take form and speak. Her question was the trigger, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" In that moment, Saul did not command a spirit. He accessed his own deepest wound. His answer, Samuel, was the name of his guilt, his shame, his severed connection to the divine. The figure that appeared then was not a ghost, but a waking dream, a guilt complex given a voice and a robe. The prophecy it spoke was not a revelation from God, but the logical conclusion of Saul's own fears, articulated with the authority of the man who knew him best. Of course, this internal Samuel knew intimate details. They were Saul's own memories. Of course, he predicted doom. Saul's strategic mind knew the battle was likely lost, and his guilt believed he deserved that loss. The hallucination simply gave his own inevitable conclusions, the crushing weight of divine decree. This psychological interpretation does not diminish the story's power. It deepens it in a profoundly human way. It asks us to consider the terrifying creativity of a mind under extreme duress. When every external source of guidance fails, the mind can turn inward and stage its own trial, with its own fears serving as both prosecutor and judge. The witch's role shifts fascinatingly. She is the facilitator, the one who provides the ritual container, the suggestive prompts, the expectant silence that allows the patient's own psyche to do the work. Her shock at seeing Samuel could be genuine surprise at the intensity and specificity of Saul's reaction, the raw force of the vision he was describing. Her subsequent kindness, offering food and comfort, is then the act of a caregiver who has witnessed someone have a devastating psychological break in her home. She is tending to a man in the throes of a psychic emergency. This view bridges ancient and modern in a startling way. It suggests that the experience of the numinous, of confronting a seemingly external spiritual reality, can sometimes be a dialogue with the deepest parts of ourselves. The ancients called this a spirit or a ghost. We might call it a complex or a trauma response. Both frameworks attempt to explain the same overwhelming, personified force that seems to come from beyond the self. So, which holds more truth? Was it a ghost or a guilt projection? The story, in its elegant ambiguity, allows for both. It reminds us that the landscapes of faith and psychology are not always separate countries. Sometimes they are the same territory, mapped with different legends. In the shadowed room at Endor, a king may have truly encountered a prophet from beyond the grave, or he may have finally come face to face with the unforgiving prophet of his own soul. Both possibilities are equally haunting, and both lead to the same cold dawn on Mount Gilboa. Her story cannot be separated from the weight of the word witch. The Hebrew text describes her with the word ob, a term for a ritual pit or a medium, which is grammatically neutral, capable of referring to a man or a woman. Yet across 3,000 years of interpretation, she has been almost exclusively branded as the Witch of Endor. This linguistic narrowing is not accidental. It is the first clue to a powerful undercurrent in her tale, the intersection of gender, forbidden knowledge, and social control. In the rigidly patriarchal and theocratic world of ancient Israel, where religious and political authority was concentrated in the hands of male prophets, priests, and kings, what space was left for a woman's power? Her authority came not from a temple or a throne, but from a deep, subversive understanding of the old ways, the rites that existed before kings and outside the official covenant. In a society that demanded spiritual purity and centralized revelation, her very existence was an act of resistance. She held a dangerous form of knowledge, the technique to bridge worlds, and she operated autonomously in the hills, answerable to no male authority. This made her simultaneously vulnerable, as her fear of Saul's law shows, and incredibly potent, as the king's desperate journey proves. Her craft provided a service so essential that even the man who outlawed it was compelled to seek it out. This dynamic forces a provocative question. Was her practice a rare pocket of subversive female authority in a world designed to suppress it? She wielded a power that the state could not replicate, and the official religion condemned, yet could not eradicate. When every approved channel for Saul had gone silent, her illicit one still worked. That is a profound, if terrifying, form of influence. It operates in the shadows, but in moments of crisis, the shadows become the only place left to look. Her story, then, becomes a blueprint for a pattern that would repeat for millennia. Throughout history, women who operated outside sanctioned structures, who possessed knowledge of herbs, midwifery, folk healing, or spiritual practices, were often viewed with a mixture of dependence and deep suspicion. They were needed for their skills, but feared for their independence. When societal tensions rose, when crops failed, or when unexplained illnesses spread, these women became convenient scapegoats. Their knowledge was rebranded not as wisdom, but as dark magic, their autonomy recast as a pact with evil. The early modern witch hunts in Europe and America are the most horrific extension of this pattern, where tens of thousands, predominantly women, were tortured and executed based on accusations rooted in misogyny and fear of the unfamiliar. The biblical narrative of Endor, while not a witch hunt, plants a potent seed. It establishes an archetype, the woman with forbidden spiritual knowledge who lives on the margins, who is sought in secret and feared in public. It links female power outside the home with the occult, creating a toxic association that would be exploited for centuries. By forever labeling her as the witch, rather than the medium or the woman of Endor, our tradition has unconsciously participated in that marginalization. It has emphasized the illicit nature of her act over the complexity of her person. To reclaim her story is to see her not as a one-dimensional sorceress, but as a complex figure navigating a world that offered women few paths to power, and punished them harshly for walking the ones they found. She reminds us that the title witch has always been less about magic and more about who controls the narrative of what is sacred, who is allowed to know, and who must be silenced. The word used for Samuel's apparition is perhaps the most shocking detail of all. The text does not call him a ghost or a spirit in the common sense. It calls him Elohim. This is the same Hebrew word used for God, for gods, and for supernatural beings of immense power. Its use here is a thunderclap of ambiguity. Does it mean the woman saw a divine being, a godlike figure? Does it imply Samuel had been elevated to a supernatural status in death? Or was this simply the ancient term for a terrifying and majestic apparition from the other side? This single word choice fractures any simple reading. It suggests that what manifested in that room was not a faint, wispy shade, but an entity of overwhelming spiritual presence, something that defied easy categorization. It forces the question, had Samuel become something more than a human soul in Sheol? Or was the vision so awe-inspiring that only the word Elohim could do it justice? This linguistic mystery lies at the very heart of the encounter's unsettling power. Then there is the nature of her own power, her orb. We've translated it as a familiar spirit, but that idea itself is a thicket. Was the orb an external spirit, a low-ranking supernatural entity that served as her guide or helper, the source of her information. Many ancient cultures believed in such helper spirits, and this interpretation paints her as a true sorceress with a supernatural ally. Or does the word refer instead to the ritual pit itself, the technique she used, the hollow vessel of her own body in a trance state? In this reading, she was not commanding a spirit, but mastering a method of altering her own consciousness to become a conduit. The text does not clarify. It leaves the mechanism hauntingly vague, allowing us to see either a pact with a paranormal entity or a profound skill in psychic mediumship. This ambiguity extends to Saul's own perception. The narrative carefully states that the woman saw Samuel. Saul then asks her, "What do you see?" She describes an old man wrapped in a robe. Only then does Saul understand or perceive that it is Samuel. He bows his face to the ground. The sequence is critical. Did Saul ever actually see the apparition with his own eyes? Or did he only hear the woman's description, and then hear the voice that spoke, inferring the presence from sound and her testimony? The text leaves a deliberate gap. It allows for the possibility that Saul, in his terrified and starved state, experienced the event primarily as a voice in the dark, a voice given form by the medium's words. This gap is where interpretation rushes in. For some, it supports the psychological reading that the vision was hers, and he absorbed it secondhand. For others, it underscores the medium's genuine skill. She was the seer, and he was the client receiving the message. These are not minor scholarly quibbles. They are the cracks in the narrative through which the story's true mystery bleeds. The Bible does not give us a clean, resolved, supernatural event. It gives us a report filled with strange terminology, shifting perspectives, and unanswered questions. It presents a night where categories blurred, where a dead prophet could be called Elohim, where a banned practice produced a devastatingly true result, and where a king may have confronted a voice more than a vision. This inherent ambiguity is not a flaw in the story. It is the source of its enduring fascination. It refuses to be pinned down. It invites us, even forces us, to bring our own beliefs about the afterlife, the occult, and divine justice to the text. The mystery is the point. We are left like Saul in that shadowy room, straining to understand what is really happening in the space between the words, knowing that the answer we find says as much about us as it does about the woman of Endor. So what then is the true story of the Witch of Endor? It is not a tale of black magic triumphing over faith. It is a profound, tragic study of a human soul colliding with the machinery of its own destiny. At its core, this is a story about the terrible price of disobedience and the utter futility of seeking forbidden shortcuts. King Saul's journey to Endor was the final logical step of a man who had spent years running from the consequences of his own choices. When the approved paths of prayer and prophecy fell silent, he did not repent, he did not wait. He sought a back door to the divine will, a way to get an answer without submitting to the authority that gave it. He believed he could use the tools of the outlawed Shadowlands to force a revelation from the very God who had rejected those tools. The result was not guidance, but a mirror held up to his fate. The seance succeeded only in making the inevitable crushingly, personally clear. In seeking to avoid his destiny, he ran directly into its arms, and the ghost of his own conscience told him the time. This is the story's central warning, that when we seek answers from places we have been commanded to avoid, we may get the truth. But it will be a truth that breaks us, not saves us. The clarity of divine judgment, when it finally speaks, offers no negotiation. It simply is. And in that stark, unforgiving light, the figure of the Witch of Endor comes into her true focus. She is not the villain of the piece. She is one of its most tragic operators. She is a woman of genuine skill, a keeper of ancient, technical knowledge about thresholds between worlds. Her craft was real enough to terrify her when it worked beyond her control. Yet she is also a figure of surprising, subversive compassion. In the wake of delivering a sentence of death, she did not gloat or flee. She saw a broken man and offered him the fundamental human comforts of food, warmth, and a moment of care. She fulfilled her role as a medium, and then transcended it as a human being. She operated within a system that had branded her an abomination. Yet in her final act, she displayed a mercy that the system's own king could not find. Her story, therefore, transcends a simple debate about ghosts and sorcery. It becomes a timeless exploration of the human condition at its most desperate crossroads, where fear, faith, and fate collide. Fear drives us to seek knowledge anywhere we can find it. Faith calls us to trust in a path we cannot see. And fate is the destination we meet, whether we arrive by the high road or the hidden one. The Witch of Endor stands at that junction, a reminder that the most powerful magic is not in summoning spirits, but in facing the consequences of our choices with whatever dignity and kindness we can muster, even in the gathering dark. Her story echoes because it is a human story, first and always. We began with a desperate king's midnight journey, a trek into the shadows to break his own law. We followed him to a small house in Endor, where a frightened woman practiced an art that was older than kings. We witnessed a consultation that blurred every line between the living and the dead, delivering a truth so terrible it shattered the man who sought it. And we traced the long echo of that night, from the bloody slopes of Mount Gilboa to the canvases of Baroque painters and the theories of modern psychologists. This journey reveals a narrative far richer than a simple ghost story. It is a tapestry woven from three inseparable threads. First, the historical thread, placing us in an ancient world where consulting the dead was not a bizarre outlier, but a common, universal practice from Mesopotamia to Egypt. The Witch of Endor was a remnant of that world, a living artifact of the spiritual landscape Israel's covenant sought to transform. Second, the profound theological paradox, the central mystery that has fueled debate for 3,000 years. How could a practice God expressly forbids appear to work with such devastating accuracy? The answers, whether divine exception, demonic deception, or psychological projection, each challenge our understanding of where divine sovereignty ends and human, or otherworldly, agency begins. It is a paradox that refuses a neat solution, forcing us to sit with the uncomfortable tension. And finally, the enduring power of the human drama at its heart. This is not a myth about spells and specters. It is a story about fear, about a leader so paralyzed by his future that he destroys his past to glimpse it. It is about compassion, found in the last place anyone would look, from a pair of hands that also knew the rituals of the dead. It is about the cost of seeking answers in forbidden places, and the unbearable clarity that sometimes waits for us there. The true legacy of the Witch of Endor, then, is an invitation. An invitation to look beyond the label, to see past the caricature of the cackling sorceress. To see instead a complex, skilled, and unexpectedly kind woman, operating in the margins of power, who became the unlikely catalyst for a kingdom's final reckoning. Her story asks us the biggest questions we can face. Where do we turn when every approved door seems locked? What are we willing to sacrifice for a moment of certainty, even if that certainty is our own doom? And in our own search for truth, in the dark places of history and the heart, can we recognize the humanity in the guides we meet along the way, however unlikely they may seem? We would love to hear your interpretation in the comments below. Was the spirit Samuel a demon or a vision? What does this ancient story say to you about the search for truth today? If you enjoyed this deep dive into esoteric history, please subscribe. We have many more journeys into the shadows ahead, where history, mystery, and meaning always meet.